Hello, dear traveller of the night. Welcome to this quiet corner where stories unfold like mist across ancient cobblestones, where mysteries whisper themselves into being, and where the gentle art of deduction becomes a lullaby for weary minds. I'm so grateful you've chosen to spend these twilight hours here, allowing yourself this gift of rest, this journey into slumber, wrapped within the folds of a Victorian mystery. Perhaps you've come from a bustling city, or maybe from a quiet countryside village. Wherever your day has taken you, whatever thoughts still circle like autumn leaves in your consciousness, know that this space is yours, a sanctuary designed for letting go, for allowing the day's concerns to fade, like gaslight dimming in the early morning hours. Tonight's tale concerns itself with chimneys and coal dust, with winter's deepest cold and the warmth of human compassion, with mysteries that begin in soot and end in something approaching redemption. The purpose of our time together is simple: to slow the racing thoughts, to gentle the anxious heart, to guide you toward peaceful sleep, through the methodical unraveling of a mystery that, while intriguing, carries no true danger, only wonder. Let the story wash over you like warm rain on window panes. If you drift away before the conclusion, that is precisely as it should be. The mystery will solve itself in your dreams. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The winter of 1889 descended upon London with a particular ferocity that seemed determined to prove itself memorable among all the winters that had come before. The Thames itself appeared reluctant to flow, slowed by cold that reached down into its ancient depths with icy fingers. On this specific evening in late January, the rain that had fallen steadily since morning had finally surrendered to something between mist and frozen precipitation. Not quite snow, not quite sleet, but a crystalline whisper that caught the gaslight and transformed Baker Street into something from a watercolour painting left out in damp weather, all soft edges and bleeding yellows against deep blue-grey. Within the familiar confines of 221B Baker Street, the fire in the hearth crackled with particular enthusiasm, as if aware of its sacred duty to hold back the cold that pressed against the windows like an unwelcome visitor. The flames danced their eternal dance, casting shadows that moved like living things across the wallpaper's pattern, across the stacks of books and papers that seemed to multiply of their own accord in Sherlock Holmes's sitting room. The scent of burning oak mingled with the ghost of pipe tobacco, with the leather of old books, with the faint mineral smell of London's particular winter atmosphere seeping through every crack and crevice, despite Mrs. Hudson's best efforts at weatherproofing. I sat in my usual chair, a chair that had long since conformed itself to my shape through countless evenings such as this, holding a cup of tea that Mrs. Hudson had brought up not 10 minutes before. The china was warm against my palms, and I held it as much for that warmth as for the comfort of Earl Grey steeped to perfect darkness. Across from me, Sherlock Holmes occupied his own chair in that peculiar state between repose and readiness that characterized him during periods without active casework. His long fingers were steepled beneath his chin, his grey eyes fixed upon the fire with an intensity that suggested he was reading meaning in the flame's random patterns. Outside, the city settled into its nighttime rhythms. Somewhere distant, a hansom cab's wheels clattered across cobblestones. Farther still, a church bell marked the hour with 8 sonorous tones that seemed muffled by the cold, arriving delayed and softened like sounds heard underwater. The rain that was not quite rain continued its gentle percussion against the window panes, a sound so constant it became almost like silence, a white noise that invited the mind to wander, to drift, to let go of conscious thought. "You're wondering why I haven't taken a case in nearly a week," Holmes said suddenly, his voice quiet, almost dreamlike, not looking away from the fire. It was not a question. I smiled slightly, long accustomed to these small demonstrations. I confess the thought had crossed my mind, though I also confess I've rather enjoyed the peace. "Peace," Holmes repeated, tasting the word as if it was something exotic, something requiring analysis. "Yes, I suppose there is a certain peace in stillness, though it sits upon me like a weight. The criminal classes appear to have taken a holiday, Watson. Even London's most dedicated malefactors seem disinclined to venture out in such weather. Can you blame them? Only fools, and the desperate brave such cold." As if summoned by his words, a sound emerged from the street below, the unmistakable pattern of hurried footsteps, someone walking quickly despite the treacherous conditions. Holmes's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, his attention redirecting from the fire to the window, to the door, to the stairs we could not see but could hear so clearly after years of residence. The footsteps belonged to someone slight, their tread light but purposeful. They paused at our street door. A moment later, the bell rang, not the confident pull of someone expecting welcome, but a hesitant, almost apologetic chime. We heard Mrs. Hudson's progress from her quarters below, heard the muffled exchange at the door, heard her footsteps ascending to our landing. Her knock was gentle, and at Holmes's invitation, she entered with an expression that suggested both concern and curiosity in equal measure. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she began, her Scottish accent softened by years in London, but never quite erased. "There's a young person asking to see you. A girl, I think, though it's difficult to tell beneath all that. Well, she's covered in soot, gentlemen, an absolute state. Normally, I'd not let someone so filthy pass the threshold, but she's shaking with cold, and there's something in her eyes. Desperation, I'd call it. She says it's a matter of life and death, though they all say that, don't they?" Holmes was already rising, his earlier lassitude vanishing like morning fog under sunlight. "Send her up immediately, Mrs. Hudson, and perhaps some hot tea, and if you have any of that soup from dinner, a bowl would not go amiss." Mrs. Hudson nodded and withdrew, and I heard her descend, heard the murmur of kind words, heard 2 sets of footsteps return. Mrs. Hudson's familiar tread, and something lighter, more hesitant, accompanied by a faint shuffling that might have been cold feet reluctant to climb another step. The figure that appeared in our doorway was indeed covered in soot, as if someone had taken a child and rolled her in coal dust as a cruel jest. She was perhaps 12 or 13 years old, dressed in clothes that might once have been a boy's. Loose trousers, a shirt several sizes too large, a thin jacket that provided no meaningful protection against January's bite. Her face, what could be seen of it beneath the grime, was thin and pale, with large dark eyes that darted from Holmes to me to the room itself, taking in the warmth, the light, the safety of this place, with an expression that suggested such things were foreign luxuries. "Come in, child," Holmes said, his voice gentler than I had heard it in some time. "Come to the fire. You're quite safe here." She hesitated at the threshold, and I understood her reluctance. She was filthy, and this was clearly a room of refinement and cleanliness. The girl looked down at herself, at the soot that covered her like a second skin, at the trail of dark footprints she had already left on Mrs. Hudson's clean floor. "I'll dirty everything," she whispered, her voice hoarse, as if from disuse or smoke or both. "Dirt can be cleaned," I said, rising and approaching her slowly, as one might approach a frightened animal. "Cold and hunger are more pressing concerns. Please, come sit by the fire." With visible reluctance, she entered the room properly, moving toward the fire with the magnetic pull of someone who has been cold for far too long. Holmes indicated the chair I had just vacated, and after another moment's hesitation, she perched on its edge, her thin body beginning to shudder with the involuntary trembling that comes when warmth meets deep cold. Mrs. Hudson arrived with remarkable speed, bearing a tray laden with a steaming teapot, a bowl of thick soup that sent rich, savoury smells into the room, and a clean cloth that was clearly meant for the girl's face and hands. She set the tray on the small table beside the chair, gave the girl an encouraging nod, and withdrew with a concerned glance at Holmes. "Now then," Holmes said, settling back into his own chair, his manner as casual as if we regularly received soot-covered waifs at this hour. "Before we discuss why you've come, might we have your name?" The girl accepted the cloth with blackened hands and began to clean her face with mechanical movements, revealing features delicate despite the harshness of her circumstances. "Sally," she said, between swipes of the cloth. "Sally Wicks. I'm a climbing boy. Well, not a boy, but that's what they call us, innit? The ones what go up the chimneys." She set aside the cloth, which was now black with soot, and reached for the soup with trembling hands. The first spoonful seemed to require considerable effort, as if her body had forgotten how to perform such basic functions. But once reminded, she ate with the focused intensity of genuine hunger, though maintaining enough control not to make herself sick. Holmes and I waited in silence, letting her eat, letting the warmth seep into her bones. The fire crackled its approval, sending up a small shower of sparks that disappeared up our own clean, well-maintained chimney. Outside, the weather continued its quiet assault on the city, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, a lonely sound, quickly swallowed by the cold. When the bowl was empty and the tea half consumed, the colour had begun to return to Sally's cheeks, and her shivering had subsided to occasional tremors. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his hands still steepled, his expression one of focused attention that could make anyone feel as if they were the most important person in the world. "Tell us," he said simply. And Sally Wicks, climbing boy who was not a boy, began her tale. "I work for Mr. Cratchit," she started, her voice still rough, but stronger now, warmed from within by food and tea. "Well, worked, I suppose. He's a master sweep with roots all through Marylebone and St. John's Wood. Has 6 children working for him, all of us small enough to fit up the flues. It's terrible work, Mr. Holmes, sir. Doctor. Terrible dark and hot when the chimneys are still warm. Terrible cold when they're not. The soot gets everywhere, in your eyes and nose and mouth and lungs. You cough black for weeks when you start." She paused, her hands wrapped around the teacup as if it was something precious, something to be protected. The firelight caught in her dark eyes, and I could see the intelligence there, the awareness that circumstance had tried but failed to extinguish. "But I needed the work," she continued. "My mother died 2 years back, and my father's in debtor's prison in Southwark. Mr. Cratchit paid a few shillings a week, and that kept me in food and a corner to sleep in his cellar. Not good work, but work, you understand. Better than the workhouse, better than the streets. Holmes nodded slowly. I understand. These are circumstances that should shame our society, but that is a larger conversation for another time. What has happened, Sally, that brings you here on such a night? She took a deep breath, and I noticed her hands tightening around the cup. It's about the houses we sweep, sir. The big ones up in St. John's Wood. The ones where the rich folk live. There's been something strange happening these past 2 months. Something that Mr. Cratchit didn't want us talking about. Said we'd lose all our good roots if we went spreading tales. But you're spreading tales now, Holmes observed without judgment, merely noting the fact. Because Billy's gone missing, she said, her voice cracking slightly. Billy Thornton, he's only 9, smallest of all of us, could fit up flues that even I couldn't manage. He went up a chimney 3 days ago in a house on Acacia Avenue, and he never came down. The fire popped sharply, sending up another small shower of sparks, and I found myself leaning forward, my physician's concern awakened by the thought of a child trapped in a chimney, suffocated by soot, or wedged immobile in narrow passages. Mr. Cratchit, he told the household that Billy must have run off, Sally continued, speaking faster now, as if she needed to expel the words before they poisoned her from within. Said the boy probably climbed out through a different fireplace and scarpered, that the ungrateful wretch had done a runner with the few pennies in his pocket. But Billy wouldn't do that, sir. He was scared of everything. Scared of the dark, scared of being alone, scared of the streets. He'd never just run off. And besides... She paused, setting down the teacup with a trembling hand that made the china rattle slightly against the saucer. Besides, Holmes prompted gently. Besides, I was there when he went up that chimney. I was working the ground floor fireplaces, while Billy was sent up to the 3rd floor. I heard him calling down through the flue like we do, saying he was at the first bend, then the second, then... She swallowed hard. Then I heard him scream. Not a long scream, not like if you fall or get stuck. Just a short, sharp scream, like when someone's surprised, terrible by something. And then nothing. Silence. We called up to him, but there was no answer. Mr. Cratchit said he must have gone out through another fireplace. But I went through every room in that house, Mr. Holmes, every single one, and there was no sign of Billy. No sooty footprints, no sign anyone had come down any of those chimneys, except the ones we'd already swept. Holmes's expression had shifted into what I recognized as his hunting aspect, the keen alertness of a mind that has caught the scent of genuine mystery. "This house on Acacia Avenue," he said. "Do you remember the number?" "Number 47, Sally replied immediately. "Big old place, 3 stories, built maybe 60, 70 years ago. The family's named Ashworth. They're away travelling on the continent, according to the housekeeper. Only her and a cook and a maid in residence. The housekeepers who hired Mr. Cratchit for the seasonal cleaning. And you mentioned strangeness over the past 2 months," Holmes continued, his voice maintaining that same gentle, unhurried tone that encouraged confidence. "What manner of strangeness?" Sally's gaze drifted back to the fire, and in the dancing light, she looked even younger than her years. A child forced too early into adult worries, things going missing when we're working. Nothing big, a spoon, a candlestick, a small clock from a mantel. Mr. Cratchit would get accused of running a crew of thieves. and we'd all be searched, our pockets turned out. But nothing was ever found on us. Got so bad that Mr. Cratchit started making us work in just our shirts and trousers. Nothing with pockets, nothing that could hide even a shilling. But still, things would go missing from houses after we'd been. She shifted in the chair, pulling her thin legs up beneath her, as if trying to make herself smaller, safer. And there were sounds, sometimes. When you're up in a chimney, it's usually quiet, except for your own breathing, and the scrape of your brush and your body against the brick. But sometimes, not every house, but some of them, you'd hear things. Voices, almost, but not quite. Like whispers, coming from other flues, from behind the walls. And you'd see marks sometimes, scratched into the brick where there shouldn't be any marks, where no sweep has been for months or years. What sort of marks? I asked, my curiosity now thoroughly awakened despite my drowsiness. Symbols, Sally said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Strange symbols that looked like they might be writing, but not writing in any language I've ever seen. And dates, sometimes. Old dates, from decades ago. Names, too, scratched in with something sharp. Children's names, mostly. A chill passed through me that had nothing to do with the weather outside, and I saw Holmes's eyes narrow slightly, his fingers drumming once against his chin, in a gesture that indicated deep thought. Tell me about the other children who work for Mr. Cratchit, Holmes said. Do any of them corroborate your account? Sally nodded vigorously. That's why I came to you tonight, sir. This evening, after Mr. Cratchit had gone home and left us in the cellar like always. The other children, there's 4 of us now, with Billy gone. We talked, really talked, without fear of Mr. Cratchit hearing. Everyone's seen something, heard something. Tom, he's 11. He swears he saw a face looking back at him once from deeper in a chimney. A pale face like a ghost's. But when he blinked, it was gone. And Mary, she's the only other girl. She says she felt hands grab at her ankles once when she was climbing, but there was nothing there when she looked down. The girl's composure, which had been steadily strengthening with warmth and food, began to fracture at the edges. We're all scared, Mr. Holmes. Scared that what happened to Billy will happen to one of us next. But we can't stop working. We've got nowhere else to go. And Mr. Cratchit, he won't hear any of it. Says we're just trying to get out of work, that we're making up stories. But Billy's gone. He's really gone. And I think something in that house took him. She looked up at Holmes with eyes that held both hope and despair. The expression of someone who has come to their last resort. I heard about you, sir. Heard you're a man who can find what's lost, who can solve puzzles no one else can solve. I know I haven't got money to pay you. I've only got 3 shillings to my name, and that's hidden in my shoe. But I'm begging you, please, help us find Billy. Help us understand what's happening. Please. The word hung in the air like a prayer, like the last candle flame in a dark church. And I found my gaze moving to Holmes, curious how he would respond. The firelight played across his angular features, highlighting the sharp intelligence in his eyes. The thin lips pressed together in thought. Outside, the weather that was almost snow continued its gentle assault, and the clock on the mantel ticked its steady rhythm, marking seconds that felt suspended, stretched out like honey dripping from a spoon. Finally, Holmes unfolded himself from his chair with the fluid grace that characterized his movements and crossed to the window. He pulled back the curtain slightly, looking down at Baker Street's nighttime tableau. The gaslight, the the shimmer of near-frozen precipitation, the emptiness of a London street surrendered to winter's dominion. He stood there for a long moment, a silhouette against the window's dim glow, and when he spoke, his voice carried that particular note of decision, of commitment, that I had learned to recognize over our years of association. "Miss Wicks," he said, not turning from the window, "you may keep your 3 shillings. This matter interests me for reasons that have nothing to do with monetary compensation. A child is missing, possibly in grave danger, and there are aspects to your account that suggest complexities worthy of investigation. We will take your case." He turned back to face us, and I saw something in his expression that might have been anger, though it was anger directed not at present company, but at the larger injustices that created situations like Sally's. "Watson, I believe we shall need to make several visits tomorrow. First to Mr. Cratchit, then to this house on Acacia Avenue, and perhaps to several other locations as the investigation demands. For tonight, however, Miss Wicks needs proper rest in proper warmth. Mrs. Hudson maintains a small guest room that rarely sees use. I believe she would not object to its occupation under present circumstances." As if summoned by the mention of her name, we heard Mrs. Hudson's footsteps on the stairs. She had undoubtedly been listening from the landing, as was her habit when matters of interest were being discussed in our rooms. Holmes opened the door before she could knock. "Mrs. Hudson, our young friend will be staying the night, if you have no objection. She has had a difficult time of late, and requires the sort of rest that only genuine safety can provide." Mrs. Hudson looked past Holmes to Sally, and her expression softened in that particularly maternal way that suggested she would not only have no objection, but would likely sit up half the night, ensuring her unexpected guest had everything necessary for comfort. "Of course, Mr. Holmes. The guest room is always ready, and I believe I have a nightgown that might serve, though it will be rather large. Come along, dear. Let's get you properly clean and into a warm bed." Sally rose from the chair with visible reluctance, as if afraid that leaving this room might break the spell of safety, might return her to the harsh realities waiting beyond these walls. But she followed Mrs. Hudson toward the door, pausing at the threshold to look back at Holmes and me. "Thank you," she said simply, and those 2 words carried more weight than any lengthy speech could have held. "Thank you for believing me." "We shall see what there is to believe," Holmes replied, but his tone was kind. "Rest now. Tomorrow's investigations will require your assistance, and for that you must be restored. Good night, Miss Wicks." "Good night, sirs," she murmured, and then she was gone, following Mrs. Hudson down the stairs, leaving behind only the faint scent of soot and the darker shadows of the mystery she had brought into our comfortable sanctuary. Holmes returned to his chair and reached for his pipe, beginning the familiar ritual of packing tobacco with the same methodical precision he brought to all tasks. I observed him in silence, knowing he was already processing what we had heard, already forming theories and questions, already planning the next day's investigative steps. The fire had burned lower, and I rose to add another log, enjoying the small burst of sparks that accompanied the fresh wood's introduction to the flames. "A chimney sweep," Holmes said finally, pipe now lit, sending up its own curls of aromatic smoke to join the room's comfortable haze. "When I was a boy, Watson, I remember seeing the climbing boys in the chimneys at the family estate. Small, filthy creatures who seemed barely human, so covered in soot were they. Even then, I thought it barbaric, this practice of sending children up into darkness and suffocation. The law changed, as you know. The Chimney Sweepers Act, meant to protect children from such labour. But laws written in Parliament and laws enforced in the streets of London are often very different creatures. He drew on his pipe, the ember glowing bright in the dimmer light. A child has vanished from inside a chimney, inside a house with limited occupants and exits. On the surface, it suggests several possibilities: accident, deliberately hidden escape, or foul play of some variety. The scratched symbols and reports of missing items add layers of strangeness that could indicate anything from supernatural interference, which I do not credit, to something more elaborate and more earthly. The girl seemed genuine, I offered, settling back into the chair Holmes had abandoned. I saw no signs of deception, and her fear appeared authentic. Agreed. Whatever the truth of this mystery, Miss Wickes believes every word of her account. That does not, of course, make those words objectively true. Perception and reality often maintain a casual relationship at best. But it does tell us that something has genuinely frightened her and her companions, something beyond the ordinary hardships of their unfortunate profession. He fell silent, staring into the fire once more, and I let my own mind wander over the strange elements of Sally's story. A child screaming once, sharply, then vanishing completely. Symbols scratched into chimney bricks. Whispers in the darkness. Items disappearing from houses after the sweeps had visited. Taken individually, each element might admit of mundane explanation. Combined, they formed a pattern that suggested something more complex, more deliberate, more worthy of Holmes's particular talents. The clock struck 9, its chimes gentle in the quiet room. Outside, London continued its nighttime existence, muted by cold and weather. A coal cart passed in the street below, its wheels grinding against cobblestones. The driver calling out some half-heard phrase to his horse. The sound faded, absorbed by the particular acoustic dampening that winter weather created, leaving only the fire's crackle and the soft percussion of near snow against glass. "We should retire," Holmes said eventually, though he made no move to rise. "Tomorrow will require early rising. Mr. Cratchit likely begins his rounds at dawn, and I wish to observe his operation and his crew before making our intentions known. You need not accompany me for the initial surveillance, Watson. I know you value your morning rest." "I'll come," I replied, knowing that sleep would be difficult now, with visions of lost children and dark chimneys populating my imagination. "Someone should ensure you don't climb into a chimney yourself in pursuit of evidence." Holmes's lips quirked in what might have been amusement. "I assure you, my climbing days are behind me. No, our investigation will proceed through more conventional channels. Observation, interrogation, examination of physical evidence, and the application of deductive reasoning to assemble truth from fragments. Somewhere in the chimneys and houses of St. John's Wood, there exists an explanation for young Billy Thornton's disappearance. We simply must uncover it before another child vanishes into darkness." I nodded, finishing my long cold tea and setting the cup aside. We each retired to our respective chambers, and I went through the familiar motions of preparing for bed, washing, changing into nightclothes, pulling back covers that Mrs. Hudson had warmed with a bed warmer earlier in the evening, a small luxury for which I was particularly grateful, given the cold that had seeped into every corner of the building despite the fire's best efforts. But sleep, when it came, was restless and populated with strange images, narrow passages that grew narrower, darkness that pressed like physical weight, and somewhere, always somewhere, just beyond reach, a child's voice calling for help that never quite arrived. Morning arrived with the grudging illumination of a winter sun that seemed reluctant to fully commit to rising, instead providing only a grey half-light that turned London into a study in charcoal and ash. I woke to the sounds of Mrs. Hudson moving about below, the clink of china suggesting breakfast preparations, and the low murmur of voices that indicated Holmes was already awake and in conversation. When I emerged from my room, dressed in my warmest clothes in preparation for a day that promised little warmth, I found Holmes and Sally Wicks seated at our small breakfast table, the girl looking remarkably different when clean and properly fed. Mrs. Hudson had indeed found a nightgown for her, and though Sally was now back in her own clothes, which had apparently been brushed and beaten as clean as their condition allowed, the soot was gone from her skin, revealing a face that, while thin and marked by hardship, possessed a certain delicate prettiness that circumstance had tried to obscure. Her dark hair, now clean, had been tied back with what I recognized as one of Mrs. Hudson's own ribbons, a small kindness that spoke volumes about our landlady's tender heart. "Good morning, Watson," Holmes greeted me, gesturing to the third chair at the table. "Miss Wicks has been providing additional details about Mr. Cratchit's operation and the houses they service. It appears there are 7 primary locations where they perform regular seasonal cleanings, and 47 Acacia Avenue is but one of them. 2 others have been sites of the mysterious occurrences she described last night." I took my seat, accepting the cup of coffee Mrs. Hudson poured with the gratitude of one who has not slept particularly well. "Good morning, Sally. I trust you found the accommodations acceptable." "More than acceptable, sir," she replied, her voice still carrying that rough quality, but stronger than yesterday's whisper. "I haven't slept in a proper bed since my mother died. Mrs. Hudson even brought me warm milk before sleep. I don't know how to thank you all." "Helping us find Billy will be thanks enough," I said gently. "Holmes, what's our plan for the day?" Holmes buttered a piece of toast with the same precision he brought to all activities, his movements deliberate and controlled. "We begin with observation. Mr. Cratchit's quarters are in Marylebone, in a warehouse district near Edgware Road. Miss Wicks informs me that he typically assembles his crew at first light and dispatches them to various locations, depending on the day's schedule. Today, apparently, they are meant to complete work at a house on Portland Place, a residence unconnected to our mystery, but useful for observing Cratchit's methods and character." He took a bite of toast, chewed thoughtfully, swallowed. "Following that, we shall visit 47 Acacia Avenue. I have taken the liberty of sending a message to the housekeeper there, Mrs. Harrow, indicating that we are investigating irregularities in sweep services across the city and wish to examine their chimney system. A small fabrication, but one that should grant us access without revealing our true purpose. Not yet, at any rate." "And me, sir?" Sally asked, her hands wrapped around her own cup of tea, as if the warmth it provided had become essential to her existence. "What should I do?" "You, Miss Wicks, will remain here under Mrs. Hudson's protection for the moment. Mr. Cratchit must not know you've come to us, not until we understand more of this situation. If he is complicit in whatever has befallen Billy Thornton, alerting him to our investigation would be disadvantageous. You will be safe here, and Mrs. Hudson will see that you're fed and warm. This afternoon, if circumstances permit, we may require your presence to guide us through some of the locations you've mentioned." Sally looked as if she might protest, but something in Holmes's expression, perhaps the absolute certainty with which he spoke, or perhaps the kindness that underlaid the command, stilled her objection. She simply nodded, accepting this arrangement with the resignation of one accustomed to having little control over circumstances. We finished breakfast with minimal conversation, the morning stillness encouraging silence more than speech. Outside, the city was waking slowly, like some great beast reluctant to leave hibernation. The sounds were muted: cartwheels, distant voices, the clop of horses on cobblestones, all softened by the cold that persisted despite the day's arrival. The window panes were etched with frost in intricate patterns, nature's artwork rendered in ice crystals that caught what little light the grey sky provided. By the time Holmes and I departed Baker Street, wrapped in our heaviest coats and scarves, the streets had achieved a sort of minimalist population, people moving about their necessary business, but without dawdling, without socializing, everyone focused on reaching their destinations as quickly as the treacherous walkways allowed. We walked in silence for a time, our breath forming clouds that dissipated quickly in the cold air, our footsteps crunching on patches of ice that had formed overnight in the low places where water collected. The journey to Edgware Road took us through neighborhoods that gradually descended in prosperity, from the respectable middle-class streets near Baker Street to the rougher commercial districts where warehouses squatted like tired giants among smaller shops and lodging houses that advertised their availability with faded signs and broken shutters. Holmes moved through these streets with the confidence of someone who had mapped London's geography, not just physically, but socially, who understood the subtle gradations of class and commerce that defined each district. "There," Holmes said quietly, nodding toward a narrow lane that branched off the main road. "According to Miss Wicks, Mr. Cratchit maintains his operation in a warehouse halfway down that alley. We shall observe from across the way." We positioned ourselves in the doorway of a closed shop, a vantage point that provided a clear view while offering some protection from both weather and observation. The warehouse Holmes had indicated was a grim structure of sooty brick, 3 stories tall but narrow, with few windows, and those that existed too dirty to see through. As we watched, figures began to emerge from a side door. Children, all of them, ranging in age from perhaps 7 to 13, all dressed in the same rough clothes, all carrying the tools of their trade: brushes with long handles, scrapers, canvas sacks that presumably collected the soot they dislodged. They assembled in a rough line, and a moment later, a man emerged from the same door. Even from our distance, Mr. Cratchit was a distinctive figure, tall and thin to the point of emaciation, dressed in a long dark coat that had seen better decades, wearing a tall hat that exaggerated his height even further. His face, what I could see of it in the grey light, was angular and stern, with a prominent nose and thin lips set in a perpetual expression of disapproval. He carried a walking stick, and as we watched, he used it to gesture sharply at the children, his mouth moving in what were presumably instructions or commands we were too distant to hear. The children responded with the choreographed efficiency of long practice. separating into two groups. The smaller group, 3 children, began loading their equipment into a small cart, while the larger group simply hefted their tools and began walking down the alley toward the main road. Cratchit followed the larger group, his long strides covering ground quickly, his stick tapping against cobblestones with a rhythm that sounded almost musical in its regularity. "He divides his workforce," Holmes murmured, his eyes tracking the groups. "Efficient from a business perspective. The cart likely carries the children and equipment to more distant locations, while those on foot manage nearby appointments. We'll follow the walking group. They're headed toward Portland Place, I'd wager, which aligns with Miss Wicks's information." We fell in behind Cratchit and his small crew, maintaining enough distance to avoid notice, but staying close enough to keep them in view. The children walked with their heads down, whether from cold or habit or fear was difficult to determine. They were silent, no chatter or horseplay, such as one might expect from youngsters, just the grim march of small workers towards their day's labour. Portland Place emerged from the grimmier streets like a jewel among stones. Wide boulevards, elegant townhouses, the unmistakable markers of wealth and taste. The neighbourhood was waking with greater activity here, servants already about their morning duties, carrying packages, scrubbing steps, polishing brass fixtures that gleamed even under the overcast sky. Cratchit and his crew seemed almost obscene in this setting, their soot and poverty a stark reminder of the labour that maintained such elegance, usually unseen, usually relegated to early morning hours before the respectable classes emerged. They stopped before number 23, an impressive 4-story townhouse with a facade of pale stone that seemed to glow against the grey morning. Cratchit knocked at the servants' entrance in the rear, and after a brief conversation with someone we couldn't see, the children filed inside, swallowed by the house's depths. Cratchit himself remained outside, leaning against the wall, smoking a cigarette with the patient air of one accustomed to waiting. "Interesting," Holmes said quietly. "He doesn't supervise the actual work, trusts the children to complete their tasks without oversight, or perhaps prefers not to dirty himself climbing about in chimneys. Let us see what we can learn." Before I could ask what he intended, Holmes had stepped from our concealment and was walking directly toward Cratchit with the confident stride of someone who had every right to be there. I followed, adjusting my expression to match Holmes's air of official business. "Mr. Cratchit?" Holmes inquired as we approached, his tone polite, but carrying an edge of authority. The sweepmaster turned, his eyes narrowing as he assessed us. Up close, he was even more unpleasant than distance had suggested. His face was deeply lined, whether from age or weather was unclear, and his eyes were small and dark, set deep beneath prominent brows. When he spoke, his voice was rough and tinged with an accent that suggested origins in London's East End, though time had softened some of its harsher edges. I'm Cratchit. What's your business? If you're looking for sweep services, you'll need to make an appointment. I'm all booked through February." "We're not seeking services," Holmes replied, producing a small notebook from his pocket and flipping it open in a gesture that suggested official investigation, without explicitly claiming any particular authority. "We're conducting inquiries regarding chimney sweep operations across the city. Specifically, we're investigating reports of irregularities, missing items from households, damage to chimney structures, and concerns about worker welfare. I trust you'll cooperate fully." Cratchit's expression shifted from suspicion to something darker. Anger mixed with wariness. The look of a man who has navigated many confrontations with authorities, both legitimate and self-appointed. Irregularities? What sort of nonsense is that? I run an honest operation, have done for 20 years. Never had a serious complaint. Never stolen so much as a copper penny from any household I've serviced. "I'm certain that's true," Holmes said smoothly, his tone suggesting he believed nothing of the sort. "Nevertheless, there have been reports. Tell me, Mr. Cratchit, how many children currently work for you?" "5, Cratchit answered, then seemed to reconsider. "5 at present. Had 6, but one of the boys run off last week. Ungrateful wretch. I'd fed him and sheltered him, and he repays me by disappearing in the middle of a job." "The boy who ran off," Holmes said, and I heard the quotation marks in his tone. "Would that be Billy Thornton?" The name hung in the cold air between us, and I saw Cratchit's eyes widen almost imperceptibly before his expression locked down into careful neutrality. "Aye, Billy Thornton, 9 years old, small for his age, which made him useful for the tighter flues. Went up a chimney in St. John's Wood, and never came down. Must have found another way out, and decided to take his chances on the streets rather than honest work." "Which house was this?" Holmes asked, his pencil poised above his notebook, as if ready to record details, though I knew he was merely maintaining the charade of official inquiry. 47 Acacia Avenue, Cratchit said, his reluctance visible. "Big old place, family away travelling, only the staff in residence. I've swept that house a dozen times over the years, never had any problems before. The boy just took it into his head to run. Happens sometimes with the ungrateful wretches." He spat to the side, a gesture of contempt that made my physician's sensibilities recoil. "You spend money feeding them, housing them, teaching them a trade, and they repay you by running off first chance they get. That's the thanks you receive for Christian charity." Holmes made a show of writing in his notebook, his expression carefully neutral. "And you've made no attempt to locate the boy, filed no report with the police?" Cratchit's laugh was short and bitter. "The police? They've no interest in missing chimney sweeps, sir. Children run away from masters every day in this city. It's a fact of life. I reported it to the housekeeper at the Acacia Avenue place. Told her the boy must have gone out through another fireplace and done a runner, and that was that. What else was I to do?" "What else indeed?" Holmes murmured, closing his notebook with a decisive snap. "Tell me about the other children. Are they treated well? Fed adequately? Given time for rest?" "They're treated as well as their station permits," Cratchit said, his tone growing defensive. "They're fed daily, they've a place to sleep, they're not beaten unless they've earned it through laziness or disobedience. That's more than most chimney sweeps can say, I'll have you know. There's masters in this city who treat their climbers worse than dogs. Mine at least get a roof and regular meals." Holmes nodded slowly, as if weighing Cratchit's words. "How long have you been in the chimney sweep business, Mr. Cratchit?" 23 years come April," the man replied, some pride entering his voice. "Worked as a climbing boy myself as a child, then apprenticed to a master, eventually bought out his roots when he retired. Built it up to what it is now, through hard work and honest dealing. I know every chimney in Marylebone and half of St. John's Wood besides. There's not a flue in this city too complex for my crew to handle." "Impressive," Holmes said, and I detected the faintest note of irony that Cratchit entirely missed. One final question, if you'll indulge me. Have you noticed anything unusual in the houses you service? Strange markings in the chimneys, perhaps? Missing items? Anything out of the ordinary? For the briefest moment, something flickered across Cratchit's face. Fear, perhaps, or recognition, or guilt, or some combination thereof. But it passed quickly, replaced by studied indifference. Can't say I have. Chimneys are chimneys, sir. Dark and sooty, and exactly what you'd expect. As for missing items, I've been accused of theft more than once, as I mentioned, but never has anything been found in my possession or my workers' possession. Probably the household staff helping themselves and blaming the sweeps. Common enough practice, I'd say. Holmes closed his notebook entirely and returned it to his pocket. Thank you for your time, Mr. Cratchit. I'm certain we'll speak again soon. Good day. We walked away before Cratchit could respond, leaving him leaning against the wall with his cigarette, his expression troubled despite his defensive words. Once we had rounded the corner and were out of sight, Holmes's pace quickened, and I matched his stride. Your impression? He asked, without preamble. He's hiding something, I replied immediately. His reaction to Billy's name, his quick dismissal of the boy's disappearance as a voluntary flight, it felt rehearsed, as if he'd prepared those explanations for potential inquiry. Agreed, though whether he's hiding complicity in something sinister, or merely the negligence of an employer who cares little about the welfare of his charges, remains to be determined. Did you notice his hands, Watson? I cast my mind back to our conversation. I confess I didn't pay particular attention to them. They were clean, Holmes said, a note of significance in his voice. Remarkably clean for a man who supposedly works daily with soot and chimneys. His clothing, too, while worn and old-fashioned, was free of the occupational grime one would expect. Mr. Cratchit has moved beyond the physical labour of his trade, positioning himself as a manager who directs children to do the actual work. This speaks to a certain business acumen, but it also creates distance. He is not present when the children climb into those dark spaces. He cannot know with certainty what they encounter there. We turned onto a main thoroughfare, hailing a hansom cab that appeared through the grey morning like a blessing. Holmes gave the driver the address on Acacia Avenue, and we climbed inside, grateful for even the minimal protection from the cold that the cab's interior provided. As we rode through London's streets, Holmes fell into a contemplative silence, his eyes distant, his mind clearly processing the information we had gathered. I let him think, knowing from experience that interrupting his contemplative states rarely produced useful results. Instead, I watched the city pass outside our window, the endless variety of humanity going about its business, the shops opening their shutters, the hawkers beginning their daily calls, the great churning mechanism of urban life engaging for another day, despite the cold that should have slowed it. St. John's Wood, when we reached it, presented a marked contrast to the areas we had travelled through earlier. The houses sat back from the streets, behind iron fences and small gardens, rendered stark by winter, but undoubtedly lovely in spring and summer. Trees lined the avenues, their bare branches reaching skyward like supplicants seeking mercy from the grey heavens. The architecture favoured grand statements, tall windows, ornate facades, the occasional turret or widow's walk, that suggested Victorian Gothic aspirations. These were homes that projected prosperity and taste, bastions of the upper middle classes who could not quite afford Mayfair but refused to settle for anything less than distinction. Number 47, Acacia Avenue, was indeed a large house, just as Sally had described. 3 full stories of dark brick with stone accents around the windows and doors, a steep roof punctuated by multiple chimney stacks that rose like sentinels above the slates. The house had an air of stillness about it, the particular quality that buildings take on when their primary occupants are absent. Windows were shuttered on the upper floors, and though smoke rose from one of the chimneys, suggesting occupation of some kind, the overall impression was one of waiting, of a house holding its breath until its family returned. We paid the driver and approached the servants' entrance at the rear, where Holmes applied a firm knock. A moment later, the door opened to reveal a woman in her middle years, dressed in the black bombazine that indicated her position as housekeeper. Her face was round and pleasant, though currently marked by the wariness that unexpected visitors often provoke. "Mrs. Harrow?" Holmes inquired politely. "I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague, Dr. Watson. I believe a message was sent ahead regarding irregularities in chimney sweep services." Recognition dawned on her face, though it brought little comfort. "Oh yes, Mr. Holmes. I received your note this morning. Do come in, though I confess I'm not certain what help I can provide. The sweep service was completed last week, and while that poor boy disappeared, I don't see how examining the chimneys now will reveal anything of use." She stepped aside to admit us, and we entered into a kitchen that spoke of efficient management. Copper pots hanging in orderly rows, a large range radiating comfortable warmth, a long table scrubbed to pale smoothness by years of diligent cleaning. The scents were of baking bread and something savoury that suggested preparations for the midday meal. "Every examination reveals something, Mrs. Harrow," Holmes said gently. "Even the absence of expected evidence is itself informative. If you would be so kind as to show us the chimney where young Billy was last seen." She nodded, wiping her hands on her apron in a nervous gesture. It was the 3rd floor bedroom, the one at the corner overlooking the garden. That's where Mr. Cratchit sent the boy up, though why that particular chimney needed cleaning I couldn't say. The family's been away for 3 months, and those rooms haven't had fires lit in all that time. This detail caught Holmes's attention. I could see the sharpening of his focus. The chimney hadn't been used recently, yet Cratchit chose to have it swept. "Part of the seasonal service," Mrs. Harrow explained, as she led us through the house's interior, up servant stairs that were narrower and steeper than those used by the family. He said all the chimneys needed doing while the family was away, used or not. Something about preventing build-up that could cause problems when they return. Made sense to me at the time, though Lord knows I'm no expert on such matters. We emerged onto the 3rd floor landing, where the character of the house changed subtly. The wallpaper was less expensive here, the floor covering simpler. The overall impression one of spaces maintained, but not lavished with the attention given to the main floors. Mrs. Harrow led us down a corridor to a corner room and opened the door, standing back to let us enter. The bedroom was modest by the standards of such a house. A single bed with plain linens, a wardrobe, a small desk and chair, a washstand with pitcher and basin. Everything was clean but unoccupied, waiting. The fireplace was a simple affair, black iron grate set into a surround of dark marble, the mantel bare except for a small clock that had stopped at 3:15. The hearth itself was clean, as if recently swept, though no ash or soot remained to evidence recent use. Holmes approached the fireplace immediately, kneeling before it with no concern for his trousers or the potential for dirt. He produced a small electric torch from his pocket, a relatively recent innovation that he had taken to carrying for examinations in dim spaces, and directed its beam up into the chimney's throat. "Watson, if you would," he said, gesturing me closer. "Your eyes are often as useful as my own." I knelt beside him and peered up into the darkness, which the torch's beam penetrated only partially. The chimney rose straight for perhaps 6 feet before bending, as chimneys often did to navigate the house's structure. The brick was indeed remarkably clean, as if recently swept, though the shadows prevented seeing more than the first section. "Mrs. Harrow," Holmes called without looking away from his examination. "You mentioned you heard the boy scream?" "No, sir, that wasn't me," the housekeeper replied from the doorway. "That was Sally, the girl who worked with him. She was the one who raised the alarm. I was in the kitchens at the time." By the time I reached this room, Mr. Cratchit was already here, calling up the chimney and getting no response. Holmes withdrew from the fireplace and stood, his torch now directed at the hearth itself, examining it from different angles with the methodical thoroughness that characterized his investigative method. He ran his fingers along the stones of the surround, pressed against certain bricks as if testing their stability, examined the mantel's underside and the clock that had stopped. "This clock," he said suddenly, "has it been stopped since the family departed?" "Oh no," Mrs. Harrow said. "It was running just fine. I wind all the clocks in the house weekly as part of my duties. That one must have stopped sometime in the last few days." Holmes opened the clock's case and examined its mechanism with the torch's assistance. The mechanism appears undamaged, simply stopped. "Do you recall what time it stopped?" 3:15, as you can see, sir." "Yes, but which day? When did you last wind it?" Mrs. Harrow's face screwed up in thought. "Let me see. I do my clock winding on Monday mornings, so that would have been 4 days ago. The boy disappeared on Tuesday afternoon, around 2 o'clock, as I recall. So the clock must have stopped the following morning, Wednesday, 3:15. "Morning or afternoon?" Holmes pressed. "Well, there's no way to know for certain, is there? But the curtains were open when I came in to check on Wednesday morning, and I believe I would have noticed then if the clock had stopped. So afternoon, I'd say. Wednesday afternoon at 3:15. Holmes closed the clock case with a thoughtful expression and moved to the window, pulling aside the curtain to examine the glass, the frame, the view beyond. The window overlooked a small garden, currently dormant for winter, bordered by a high brick wall that separated this property from its neighbours. The drop from this third-floor window to the ground below was considerable. No one could have exited this way without serious injury. "Are there other ways to access this room besides the door we entered through?" Holmes asked. "None, sir. Just the one door to the corridor, and the chimney, of course, though I can't imagine how anyone could use that as an entrance or exit. Too narrow and tall." Holmes returned to the fireplace, and this time he did something that surprised both Mrs. Harrow and myself. He lay down on his back and positioned himself partially into the hearth, shining his torch upward at extreme angles. examining aspects of the chimney's lower structure that could only be seen from this undignified position. "Holmes, what on earth?" I began. "Watson, look here," he interrupted, his voice echoing slightly from within the hearth. "Bring your medical bag if you have it, specifically your examination light." I had indeed brought my bag, as I typically did when accompanying Holmes on investigations, never knowing when medical skills might be required. I extracted my own examination lamp and joined him at the hearth, lying down as he had done and directing my light where his torch illuminated. "There," Holmes said, his finger pointing to a section of brick, perhaps 5 feet up, just before the first bend in the chimney. "Do you see?" I strained my eyes against the darkness and the distortion of our angle. At first, I saw nothing unusual, just soot-darkened brick, shadows, the rough texture of masonry. But then, as I adjusted the angle of my light, I saw what had captured Holmes's attention. Scratches in the brick's surface, a pattern that looked almost deliberate, arranged in vertical lines with cross-hatching at regular intervals. "It looks like tallying marks," I said slowly, "like counting." Indeed, 5 vertical lines, then a horizontal strike through them, the traditional method of counting by 5s. "These marks are relatively fresh, Watson. See how they're lighter than the surrounding brick. Someone scratched these recently, possibly with the corner of a metal tool or perhaps a stone fragment. And look slightly to the left. What do you make of that?" I adjusted my light again and saw what he indicated. More scratches, but these formed letters, or what might have been letters if they were complete. They were partially obscured by soot, but I could make out B, T, and what might have been the beginning of a date or additional letters before the marks became illegible. "BT," I said. "Billy Thornton's initials. Possibly, or they might predate his disappearance entirely. We cannot know without further analysis. But Watson, consider this. Why would someone scratch tallies and initials inside a chimney? What purpose could such marks serve?" We extracted ourselves from the hearth, standing and brushing off our clothes, which had indeed collected a fine coating of soot despite the chimney's supposedly cleaned state. Mrs. Harrow watched us with an expression that mingled confusion and concern, clearly uncertain what we had discovered or what it meant. "Mrs. Harrow," Holmes said, his tone grave, "I need you to think very carefully. In the time the Ashworth family has been away, has anything unusual occurred in this house? Strange sounds, unexplained noises, items going missing, anything at all that struck you as out of the ordinary?" The housekeeper's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: reluctance, fear, resignation, before she finally spoke. "I didn't want to say anything, didn't want to sound like a foolish woman given to fancies. But yes, there have been sounds. At night, mostly. Sounds like something moving in the walls. Scratching sounds, tapping sounds. I told myself it was rats, or the house settling, or the wind in the chimneys. Old houses make all manner of sounds, don't they? But sometimes the sounds seemed almost like voices. Not clear enough to make out words, but patterns that sounded like speaking." She hugged herself, suddenly looking older and more vulnerable. "And things have gone missing, small things. A silver spoon from the kitchen, a small portrait miniature from the drawing room, a pair of candlesticks. I thought perhaps one of the maids had been pilfering, but when I confronted them, they swore on their mothers' graves they'd taken nothing. I didn't report it to the Ashworths, because I didn't want them to think I was running the house poorly. But I've been uneasy, gentlemen. Ever since the boy disappeared, I've felt that something in this house isn't right." Holmes nodded slowly, as if this confession confirmed suspicions he had already formed. "Thank you for your honesty, Mrs. Harrow. It's very helpful. Tell me, how many fireplaces does this house contain?" 12 in total, sir. 3 on each floor, bedrooms and main rooms, plus the kitchen range. "And how many chimney stacks?" She considered this. 4 main stacks, I believe. The chimneys are grouped together for efficiency. That's how the builder explained it when I first came into service here. "So multiple chimneys feed into each stack," Holmes mused. "A complex system, potentially with interconnecting passages at various points. Mrs. Harrow, I will need to examine the other fireplaces as well, particularly those that would share a chimney system with this one. May I have your permission to move freely through the house for the next hour?" "Of course, Mr. Holmes. I'll ask that the maids keep out of your way. Is there anything else you need?" "Just one more question. The Ashworth family. When do you expect their return?" "Not for another month at least. They've taken a grand tour of Italy and don't plan to return until March." Mr. Ashworth's letters indicate they're having a wonderful time, though Mrs. Ashworth complains about the food. Typical travelling troubles, nothing serious. Holmes thanked her, and she withdrew, leaving us alone in the bedroom with its silent fireplace and stopped clock. Once her footsteps had receded down the corridor, Holmes turned to me with an expression of focused intensity. "Watson, we have stumbled upon something more complex than a simple disappearance. Those marks in the chimney, the stopped clock, the missing items, the sounds in the walls, they suggest a pattern, a system, a purpose. Someone has been using this house's chimney system for something, and I suspect young Billy Thornton discovered what that was." "But how could anyone use the chimneys?" I protested. "They're too narrow for an adult to navigate, and even a child would struggle with the height and the bends and the risk of suffocation." "How indeed," Holmes replied, and his smile was grim. "That, Watson, is precisely what we must determine. Come, let us examine the other fireplaces. Somewhere in this house's network of chimneys and flues, there exists an answer. We simply must be clever enough to find it." We spent the next hour moving systematically through the house, examining each fireplace with the same thoroughness Holmes had brought to the bedroom's hearth. In several of them, we found similar scratches, not all showing the same tallying marks or initials, but enough to establish that multiple people over what must have been an extended period had left their marks within these chimneys. Some marks were old, softened by years of soot accumulation. Others appeared fresh, sharp-edged, recent. In the drawing room on the second floor, Holmes discovered something that made him go absolutely still, a state I had learned to recognize as indicating a finding of particular significance. He had been examining the brickwork around the fireplace's opening when his fingers found something irregular, a gap where there should have been seamless mortar. "Watson, come here," he said, quietly, and I knelt beside him. He pressed against a particular brick, and with a soft grinding sound, a section of the fireplace's interior wall swung inward on concealed hinges, revealing a narrow space behind it. Not a passage exactly, but a hiding place, perhaps 18 inches deep and 3 feet wide, carved into the thickness of the chimney's structure. The space was empty, but it showed signs of use. Faint scuff marks on the brick floor, the remains of a candle stub melted onto a small ledge. and scratched into the back wall. More marks. Dates going back years, and names, so many names, most of them childish versions or diminutives. Tommy, Annie, Jack, Sophie. The list went on, a chronicle of small visitors to this hidden space. My God, I whispered, how many children have been in here? That is the question that troubles me most, Holmes replied, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. This house holds secrets, Watson. Dark secrets that have accumulated over years, perhaps decades. And I fear young Billy Thornton is not the first child to vanish within these walls. The clock in the drawing room, not stopped, still ticking its steady rhythm, marked the passing moments with small mechanical clicks that seemed very loud in the sudden silence that followed Holmes's observation. Outside, London continued its daily existence, unknowing and uncaring of the mysteries that lurked in the chimneys and walls of its grand houses. Holmes carefully closed the hidden panel, making note of its location and mechanism. We must speak with the police, Watson. This matter has escalated beyond a simple missing child investigation. But first, I believe we should return to Baker Street and consult with Miss Wicks. She may know something about the history of Cratchit's operation, about other children who have gone missing, about patterns she hasn't yet realized were significant. We found Mrs. Harrow and informed her that our examination was complete for the moment, though we might need to return. Her relief at our departure was palpable. Whatever we had been searching for, whatever we had found, she clearly did not wish to know the details. Sometimes ignorance provided its own form of comfort, and I could not entirely fault her for clinging to it. The handsome ride back to Baker Street passed in contemplative silence. Holmes sat with his chin resting on steepled fingers, his eyes distant, his mind clearly racing through possibilities and connections. I knew better than to interrupt his thoughts, but my own mind was churning as well, troubled by the implications of what we had discovered. How long had that hidden space existed? How many children had found it, had hidden in it, had scratched their names into its walls like prisoners marking their existence? And where was Billy Thornton now? We arrived back at Baker Street to find Mrs. Hudson in a state of considerable agitation, meeting us at the door with an expression that immediately put me on alert. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said urgently, keeping her voice low. "We've had a visitor. A Mr. Cratchit came by not 20 minutes after you departed, demanding to know where Sally Wicks was. Said she'd run off from his care, and he had a right to collect her, that she was bound to his service for another year. I told him I didn't know what he was talking about, that no such girl was here, but I'm not certain he believed me." "Did he threaten you?" Holmes asked sharply. "Not directly, but there was an implication in his manner. He said he knew them detective fellows had been asking questions about his business, and that, if they was hiding one of his workers, there'd be consequences. Legal consequences, he said, though the way he said it made it sound like he meant something else entirely." Holmes's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Where is Miss Wicks now?" "In the guest room, sir." She heard his voice and became quite frightened, hid herself under the bed, poor child. "She's still there, won't come out. I've tried to coax her, but she's terrified that he'll find her." We went upstairs immediately, Holmes taking the steps 2 at a time in his urgency. The guest room door was ajar, and we could hear Mrs. Hudson's voice, soft and reassuring, coaxing Sally from her hiding place. When we entered, we found Mrs. Hudson kneeling beside the bed, speaking to the space beneath it, where Sally had indeed taken refuge. "Miss Wicks," Holmes said, his voice gentle but firm. "Mr. Cratchit has gone. He will not return to this building. I give you my word on that. Please come out. We need to speak with you about matters of considerable importance." There was a long moment of silence, then a shuffling sound, and Sally emerged from beneath the bed, her face tear-streaked, her earlier composure entirely shattered. She looked younger than ever, a frightened child rather than the streetwise survivor who had found her way to our door the night before. "He'll make me go back," she whispered. "He'll find me and make me go back, and then I'll disappear like Billy, like the others. He knows I talked to someone. He must know. That's why he came looking." "What others?" Holmes asked, seating himself in the room's only chair and leaning forward intently. "Sally, this is very important. What other children have disappeared while working for Mr. Cratchit?" Sally climbed onto the bed, pulling her knees to her chest, making herself small. "There was a boy named Peter, about 2 years ago. Went up a chimney in Regent's Park and never came down. Mr. Cratchit said he'd run away. And before that, a girl named Annie. I didn't know her, but the other children told me about her. She disappeared 3 years ago, same way. Went up a chimney and never came down. And there's been others, going back years before I started working for him. The older children would whisper about them sometimes, about the ones who disappeared into the chimneys and were never seen again." Holmes exchanged a glance with me, and I saw my own horror reflected in his expression. "How many, Sally? How many children have disappeared?" "I don't know exactly. 6, 8, maybe more. It's hard to keep count, because Mr. Cratchit cycles through children. Some age out of the work and move on to other things. Some run away for real, some just disappear. But there's always whispers about the ones who went up and never came down." She wiped at her face with the back of her hand, smearing the tears across her cheeks. The children call it the black mark. Certain houses, they say, have the black mark. Houses where strange things happen, where the chimneys seem wrong somehow. The children are scared to work those houses, but Mr. Cratchit sends us anyway. Says it's all superstitious nonsense, that chimneys are chimneys, but we know better. We know there's something wrong with those houses. "Which houses?" Holmes asked urgently. "Sally, I need you to tell me every house that the children consider to have this black mark." She nodded, taking a shuddering breath. 47 Acacia Avenue. That's one. That's where Billy disappeared. Then there's a house on Primrose Hill Road. Big place with red shutters. A house on Carlton Hill. One on Boundary Road. And I think one on Hamilton Terrace, though I'm not certain about that one. Those are the ones I know for sure. Holmes had produced his notebook and was writing rapidly. All in St. John's Wood or nearby. Most of them, yes. All big houses, all old houses. All houses that have been serviced by Mr. Cratchit for years and years. "Sally," I said gently, "when these children disappeared, did Mr. Cratchit ever involve the police? Were there ever official investigations?" She shook her head. "Not that I know of. He'd tell the household that the child had run away, and that would be the end of it. Who cares about a missing chimney sweep? We're nobody, sir. The police don't waste time looking for us." Her words struck me like a physical blow, made worse by their essential truth. In Victorian London, poor children disappeared with distressing regularity, and their absence rarely provoked official concern. They were society's invisible workers, noticed only when they failed to perform their duties, otherwise existing on the margins of awareness and compassion. Holmes stood abruptly, his decision clearly made. "Sally, you will remain here under Mrs. Hudson's protection. Watson, I need you to send an urgent telegram to Inspector Lestrade at Scotland Yard. Tell him I need to speak with him immediately regarding multiple missing children and potential foul play. Mrs. Hudson, please ensure all doors and windows are secured. If Mr. Cratchit returns, you are not to admit him under any circumstances. Tell him I am not at home and you know nothing of Miss Wickers's whereabouts." "Where are you going?" I asked, already moving to accompany him. "To the one place that might provide answers before nightfall," Holmes replied grimly. "The London Chimney Sweeps Guild. If there is a pattern to these disappearances, if other masters have experienced similar losses, the Guild will have records. And if Mr. Cratchit has been complicit in something terrible, there may be others who have harboured suspicions but lacked evidence to act." "I'll come with you," I said. "No, Watson. I need you to coordinate with Lestrade. Bring him here to speak with Sally. Her testimony will be crucial in establishing a pattern of negligence at minimum, potential criminality at worst, and then—" He paused, his expression darkening. "Then we must organize a search of those marked houses. If children have been disappearing into their chimney systems, if there is some network of hidden spaces like the one we found today, we must discover it before another child comes to harm." He was already moving toward the door, his earlier lethargy completely vanished, replaced by the focused energy that characterized him when a case had fully captured his attention. "One more thing, Sally," he said, pausing at the threshold. "These voices you mentioned hearing in the chimneys, these whispers, were they speaking English? Could you ever make out words?" Sally thought for a moment. "Sometimes, yes. They'd say things like 'help' or 'please' or 'here', like someone calling out from far away, like someone trapped." Holmes's hands clenched briefly at his sides, the only outward sign of the emotion her words provoked. "Thank you, Sally. You've been very brave to come to us. Rest now. We will find Billy if he can be found, and we will ensure no more children disappear into those dark spaces." He departed, leaving me to carry out his instructions, while Mrs. Hudson fussed over Sally, bringing her more tea and speaking in soft, comforting tones about safe spaces and good people, and how everything would be all right, even though none of us could be certain that was true. I descended to our sitting room and composed an urgent telegram to Inspector Lestrade, keeping the details vague enough to avoid panic, but specific enough to convey the gravity of the situation. Multiple missing children, pattern of disappearances, potential criminal negligence, or worse, urgent consultation required. Once dispatched via the telegram office on the corner, I settled into my chair to wait, feeding the fire to keep the room warm, trying not to think too much about children trapped in darkness, calling for help that never came. Outside, afternoon was sliding toward evening, the winter light fading early as it always did this time of year. The gas lamps along Baker Street were being lit, small islands of illumination in the gathering dark. Somewhere out there, Holmes was pursuing his own investigative threads, following the trail of missing children through records and testimonies. And somewhere out there too, Billy Thornton existed, or did not, alive or dead, trapped or escaped, or something worse than either. The clock ticked its steady rhythm. The fire crackled, London continued its vast, indifferent turning, and all I could do was wait for the next piece of the puzzle to reveal itself. Inspector Lestrade arrived within the hour, his lean, ferret-like face creased with concern, his normally skeptical expression replaced by something approaching genuine alarm. I had known Lestrade for several years through my association with Holmes, and while he and my friend maintained a relationship of mutual professional respect, tinged with friendly rivalry, I had never doubted Lestrade's essential decency or his commitment to justice, even when Holmes's methods and deductions left him baffled. "Dr. Watson," he greeted me, removing his hat and shaking off the cold that had penetrated his heavy coat. "Your telegram was extremely concerning. Missing children. What's Holmes gotten himself into this time?" I quickly summarized the situation. Sally's arrival, Billy's disappearance, the pattern of vanishings over the years, and our discoveries at the Acacia Avenue house. Lestrade listened with increasing gravity, his expression growing darker as the full scope of the situation became clear. "Christ," he muttered when I had finished, a rare profanity that indicated how disturbed he was. Children disappearing into chimneys, hidden spaces in houses, and you say this has been happening for years. Why has no one reported this to the police? "Because the children are chimney sweeps," I said quietly. "Society's invisible workers. When they disappear, their masters claim they've run away, and no one investigates further. Who would believe a chimney sweep over a respectable tradesman? Who would care enough to pursue the matter?" Lestrade's jaw tightened. "I would, if I'd known. Dr. Watson, you must understand. Scotland Yard receives reports of missing persons daily. Dozens of them. Most resolve themselves. The person returns, or is found, or the report was mistaken. But missing children, especially working children, rarely generate official reports at all. Their employers don't report them because it reflects badly on their management. The children's families, if they have families, often lack the resources or knowledge to navigate the reporting process. And without official reports, there's no investigation." "I understand," I said, and I did. Lestrade was not to blame for systemic failures that had allowed children to vanish unremarked. But we have the opportunity now to investigate properly. Sally Wicks is upstairs and can provide detailed testimony. Holmes is currently pursuing additional lines of inquiry. If we move quickly, we might yet find Billy Thornton alive, and we might uncover what has been happening in those houses. "Then, let's not waste time," Lestrade said decisively. "I'll take Miss Wicks's statement, and then I'll need to organize search parties for those houses you mentioned. We'll need warrants, which means we'll need to convince a magistrate that there's sufficient cause, which might be difficult given the nature of the allegations. Hidden spaces in chimneys, whispers in walls. It sounds like something from a Gothic novel, Dr. Watson, if you'll forgive me saying so." "I know how it sounds," I acknowledged, but Holmes found physical evidence, scratched marks, names, dates, a concealed compartment. Whatever has been happening, it's real, not supernatural or imaginary. Children have left their marks in those chimneys, Inspector. We need to discover why and what became of them. Sally provided her statement to Lestrade with remarkable composure, given her earlier distress, answering his questions with as much detail as she could provide about dates, locations, and the names of other missing children. Lestrade took notes in his efficient hand, occasionally asking for clarification. his expression growing progressively grimmer as the full scope of the pattern became clear. When the statement was complete, Lestrade stood and paced to the window, looking out at the darkening street. "I'll need to bring this to my superiors immediately. They'll want to involve the Child Welfare Board, possibly the Home Office, if the scale is as extensive as Miss Wicks suggests. But that will take time, Dr. Watson. Bureaucratic processes that could drag on for days. And if there's a child alive in one of those houses, trapped in some hidden space, days could be fatal." "What are you suggesting?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "I'm suggesting that perhaps a few concerned citizens, accompanied by a police officer, might conduct preliminary investigations of those properties tonight. Informal inquiries, you understand. Just checking on the welfare of the residents, ensuring everything is in order. If we happen to discover evidence of criminal activity or endangered persons, well, that would justify more formal intervention." It was as close to suggesting bending the rules as I had ever heard from Lestrade, and it spoke to how seriously he took this matter. Holmes is still out pursuing his own inquiries, but when he returns, I'm certain he would be willing to participate in such informal inquiries. "Good," Lestrade said. "I'll return to the yard briefly to collect a few constables I trust, men who won't balk at unusual circumstances. We'll meet back here at 7 o'clock, and then we'll visit those houses you mentioned, all of them if necessary. We'll knock on doors, we'll ask to inspect the premises under pretense of investigating the missing child, and we'll see what we find." He collected his hat and coat, preparing to depart. "Dr. Watson, one more thing. This Mr. Cratchit, do you believe he's directly responsible for these disappearances? Or is he merely negligent, allowing his workers to encounter dangerous situations without proper supervision?" I considered the question carefully. Holmes suspects something more complex than simple negligence. The hidden spaces, the pattern of disappearances from specific houses, the missing items from those same houses, it suggests a system, a purpose. Whether Cratchit is an active participant or merely aware of something he's chosen not to investigate, I cannot yet say. But there's something wrong with his operation, something that goes beyond ordinary workplace hazards. Lestrade nodded slowly. "Then we'll need to bring him in for questioning as well. I'll arrange that for tomorrow. Give us tonight to investigate the houses first, see what we find. No point alerting him that we're conducting a serious investigation until we have more evidence to confront him with." He departed, leaving me once again to wait for Holmes's return. Mrs. Hudson brought dinner up on a tray. She and Sally ate in the kitchen, the housekeeper having apparently decided that the girl needed maternal supervision more than I needed company. I picked at the food without much appetite, my mind too occupied with dark thoughts about children trapped in darkness, about the systems that had allowed such tragedies to go unnoticed and uninvestigated. Holmes returned as the clock struck 6, bursting through the door with the energized manner that indicated his afternoon had been productive. He was carrying several folders stuffed with papers, and his eyes were bright with the particular intensity that came when he was closing in on answers. "Watson, excellent. You're here. Lestrade?" He came, took Sally's statement, and will return at 7 with constables. We're to conduct informal inquiries at the houses Sally mentioned. He's working on obtaining proper warrants for tomorrow, but he agreed we couldn't wait if there's a chance Billy is alive somewhere. Excellent. Excellent. Holmes spread his folders across the table, papers spilling out in organised chaos. I've spent the afternoon at the Chimney Sweeps Guild, the Register of Births and Deaths, and the Metropolitan Police Archives. Watson, the pattern is worse than we imagined. Much worse. He pulled out a sheaf of papers, covered in his precise handwriting. The Guild maintains records of master sweeps, their registered apprentices, and their service routes. Going back 20 years, I found 11 master sweeps who serviced homes in St. John's Wood and surrounding areas. Of those 11, 8 are now deceased or retired. 3 are still active, including our Mr. Cratchit. But here's what's significant. Of the 8 who are no longer working, 6 had multiple reports of apprentices who supposedly ran away from their service, an unusually high number compared to masters working other areas of London. He pulled out another document. Cross-referencing those reports with the register, I found that most of those runaway apprentices were never heard from again. No subsequent employment records, no marriage records, no death records, nothing. They simply vanished from all official documentation. Now, granted, many working-class children lead lives that never touch official records. But the concentration of disappearances among chimney sweeps working this particular area is statistically significant. How many children are we talking about? I asked, dreading the answer. At least 30 over 20 years, Holmes said quietly. 30 children who went up chimneys in houses across St. John's Wood and were never seen again. Some were reported as runaways by their masters. Others simply disappeared from the records with no explanation at all. 30 children, Watson, and those are only the ones I could find evidence for. The actual number may be higher. Many sweeps employed children informally, without official registration, paying them pennies for brutal work with no documentation at all. The number struck me like a physical blow. 30 children, a small village worth of lives, vanished into darkness. What are we dealing with, Holmes? I asked. A serial murderer who specifically targets chimney sweeps. Someone using the children for some purpose. What could possibly explain a pattern on this scale? Holmes began pacing, his long strides carrying him from window to door and back again, his hands clasped behind his back. I don't yet have a complete theory, but certain elements are becoming clear. First, the disappearances cluster around specific houses, Sally's marked houses and several others. Second, these are old houses, built primarily between 1830 and 1860, during a period when chimney architecture was particularly complex and interconnected. Third, all the houses have been owned by wealthy families who travel extensively, leaving their properties under the care of small household staffs for extended periods. He stopped his pacing and faced me directly. Fourth, and most intriguing, several of these houses have peculiar architectural histories. I spent time in the architectural archives this afternoon, examining original building plans where they still exist. Watson, at least 3 of the houses Sally mentioned were built or renovated by the same architectural firm, Blackwood and Sons, who operated from 1835 to 1862. They specialized in grand townhouses for the newly wealthy, and they had a particular reputation for innovative chimney designs that supposedly improved heating efficiency. You think the architecture itself is significant? I asked. I think someone designed hidden spaces into these houses, Watson. Deliberately engineered passages and chambers within the chimney systems. Spaces that wouldn't appear on official plans. spaces that could only be accessed by someone small enough to navigate the narrow flues. But for what purpose? That's what we must determine. Before I could respond, we heard footsteps on the stairs, Lestrade returning with his promised constables. There were 3 of them, all young men, with the solid, reliable look of career policemen, all dressed in civilian clothing rather than uniforms to avoid drawing attention. Lestrade introduced them briefly, Constables Morrison, Pettigrew and Hayes, and they nodded their greetings with appropriate deference to Holmes, whose reputation among the police force had grown considerably over the years. "Gentlemen," Holmes said, addressing the assembled group, "tonight we are searching for a missing child and investigating a pattern of disappearances that may span 2 decades. We have 5 houses to examine, and we must approach each carefully. We're looking for hidden spaces within the chimney systems, spaces that may contain evidence, or, God willing, may still contain Billy Thornton alive. Dr. Watson and I have already examined one of the houses, but we'll need to search it more thoroughly. The others are completely unexplored." He pulled out a map of St. John's Wood and marked the locations of the 5 houses Sally had identified. "We'll work in pairs. Inspector, you'll come with me to the house on Primrose Hill Road. Watson, you'll take Constables Morrison and Pettigrew to Carlton Hill. Hayes, you'll go to Boundary Road. We'll save Hamilton Terrace and Acacia Avenue for last. Those we'll investigate together after the initial reconnaissance. Our cover story is that we're investigating the disappearance of Billy Thornton and need to verify that he hasn't accidentally hidden himself or fallen into a space within these houses. Most households should cooperate given the circumstances." Lestrade cleared his throat. "Mr. Holmes, I should mention that technically, without warrants, we have no authority to conduct searches. If we find evidence, but it's ruled inadmissible because we obtained it improperly." "Then we'll find it again properly," Holmes interrupted, not harshly, but with finality. "Inspector, a child may be alive in one of these houses, trapped in darkness, possibly injured, certainly terrified. We cannot let procedural niceties condemn him to death. If you wish to remain behind to preserve your professional standing, I would understand. But I am going, with or without official sanction." Lestrade studied Holmes for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "I never said I was remaining behind, Mr. Holmes. I merely wanted to note the irregularity for the record. Now, shall we proceed?" We bundled ourselves back into our coats and scarves, preparing to venture into the cold London night. Upstairs, Sally appeared at the top of the stairs, drawn by the sounds of activity. Holmes looked up at her with an expression that was almost gentle. "We're going to search the houses, Miss Wicks. With luck, we'll find Billy tonight. Mrs. Hudson will keep you safe here. Try to rest if you can. Please find him," Sally said, her voice small and desperate. "Please." "We will do everything in our power," Holmes promised. And then we were out into the night, into the cold that seemed even more bitter after the warmth of our rooms, into the darkness that pressed against the gas lamp's fragile circles of light. The city at night was a different creature than its daytime self, quieter, more dangerous, full of shadows and uncertain shapes. We separated at the first intersection, each group heading toward its assigned location, and Watson and I found ourselves walking through streets that grew progressively more elegant as we approached St. John's Wood proper. The house on Carlton Hill was a substantial structure of grey stone, 4 stories tall, with a columned portico that suggested classical aspirations. Lights showed in several windows, indicating someone was home. We approached the servants' entrance, where Morrison knocked firmly, the sort of knock that suggested authority without aggression. A maid answered, young and curious, and I quickly explained that we were investigating the disappearance of a chimney sweep's apprentice, and needed to verify that the boy hadn't somehow hidden himself in the house during their recent cleaning. The maid looked uncertain, but Constable Morrison's presence, he had pinned his badge to his coat, apparently decided the matter, and she admitted us, going to fetch the housekeeper. The housekeeper, who appeared, was cut from the same cloth as Mrs. Harrow, middle-aged, competent, initially suspicious of our midnight visit, but gradually warming to the explanation. Yes, they had employed Mr. Cratchit's services just last week. No, she hadn't noticed anything unusual. Yes, we could certainly examine the fireplaces if we thought it might help find the poor lost boy. We moved through the house systematically, examining each fireplace with the same thoroughness Holmes had demonstrated earlier. Morrison and Pettigrew watched with professional interest, occasionally asking questions about what we were looking for. I explained about the hidden compartment Holmes had found, about the scratched marks in chimney bricks, about the possibility of concealed spaces. It was in the third-floor study that we found it, another hidden panel, this one accessible from inside the fireplace itself, a section of brick that swung inward when pressed in the correct sequence. Behind it was a space similar to the one at Acacia Avenue, though larger, perhaps 6 feet deep and 4 feet wide, tall enough for a child to stand in. And it was not empty. In the dim light of our electric torches, we saw remnants of occupation, a few tattered blankets, the stubs of multiple candles, a tin cup, and scattered across the floor like fallen leaves, dozens of slips of paper covered in childish handwriting. I gathered several of these papers carefully, bringing them closer to the light to read. They were notes, messages scratched out in pencil or pen, some neat, others barely legible. My name is Thomas. I am 10 years old. I have been here 3 days. Please help. I can't get out. Is anyone there? Can anyone hear me? I'm scared. It's so dark. The dates on the papers ranged across years. The oldest we could make out was from 1884, 5 years ago. The most recent was dated just 2 weeks prior. Dear God, Pettigrew whispered, his young face pale in the torchlight. Children have been trapped in here, for days, by the sound of it. How did they get in? How did they get out? That's what we need to determine, I said, though my physician's instincts were already constructing grim possibilities. Morrison, take these papers as evidence. We need to show them to Holmes and Lestrade immediately. Pettigrew, help me examine the walls of this space. There may be other openings, other passages. We searched carefully, running our hands across every brick, pressing and testing, looking for irregularities, and we found them. 2 more panels, one leading to a narrow shaft that appeared to connect to other chimney flues, the other opening into a passage that ran horizontally behind the walls, perhaps designed originally to allow access for repairs, but now serving some darker purpose. The horizontal passage was too narrow for an adult, but a child could navigate it with difficulty, crawling through darkness, feeling their way along rough brick. Where it led, we couldn't determine without smaller investigators or more extensive excavation of the walls. We documented everything we found, then carefully closed the panels and made our way back downstairs. The housekeeper watched our descent with growing alarm. "Did you find the boy?" she asked. "Not the boy we're looking for," I replied carefully. "But we did find evidence that requires further investigation. I'm afraid this house will need to be examined more thoroughly, and that will require bringing in additional resources. In the meantime, I would recommend that you and your staff avoid using the fireplaces, and certainly don't employ any chimney sweeps until this matter is resolved." She agreed, clearly disturbed, but not quite understanding the full scope of what we had discovered. We took our leave and hurried back toward Baker Street to rendezvous with the others and share our findings. The night had grown colder, and a light snow had begun to fall. Not the crystalline precipitation of earlier, but true snow, fat flakes that drifted down with deceptive gentleness, beginning to accumulate on surfaces with the promise of a true winter blanket. Our breath formed clouds that the falling snow seemed to absorb and transform, adding to the general obscuration. We found Holmes and Lestrade already waiting at Baker Street, along with Constable Hayes, who had completed his investigation of Boundary Road. Hayes reported findings similar to ours: a hidden space within the chimney system, signs of occupation, more notes left by trapped children. Holmes's face was grim in the lamplight, and when I reported what we had found at Carlton Hill, including the horizontal passage, his expression grew even darker. "I found similar passages at Primrose Hill," he said. "Tunnels running behind the walls, connecting different chimney systems, creating a network that spans the entire house. Watson, these spaces were deliberately designed. Someone built these houses with hidden passages, with chambers accessible only through the chimneys, with escape routes and interconnections that don't appear on any official plans. But why? What possible purpose could such architecture serve?" "Maybe the builders were involved in smuggling," Pettigrew suggested. "Hidden passages for moving contraband." Holmes shook his head. "The passages are too small for moving goods of any significant size. They were designed for people, specifically for small people, for children." A terrible silence followed this observation, each of us contemplating the implications. Why would someone design houses with passages only children could navigate? What purpose could such architecture serve beyond the sinister? Lestrade spoke into the silence, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I think we need to consider a possibility we've all been dancing around. What if these houses were designed as some sort of trap system? What if someone has been deliberately luring or forcing chimney sweeps into these hidden spaces for purposes we can't yet fathom?" "To what end?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to hear the answer. "That's what we need to discover," Holmes said. "But time is critical now. If Billy Thornton is alive, he's been missing for 3 days. Trapped in darkness without food or water, his chances diminish by the hour. We need to search Acacia Avenue and Hamilton Terrace tonight, and we need to do so with the understanding that we're racing against time." He turned to Lestrade. "Inspector, I recommend you leave one constable here to guard Miss Wicks and Mrs. Hudson. The rest of us should proceed to Acacia Avenue immediately. It's the house where Billy was last seen, and if there's any chance he's still there, still alive, we must find him tonight." No one disagreed. Hayes volunteered to remain behind, and the rest of us, Holmes, myself, Lestrade, Morrison, and Pettigrew, set out once more into the snowy night, this time travelling by 2 hansoms to move more quickly. The streets were growing treacherous as snow accumulated, and our drivers moved cautiously, horses' hooves finding uncertain purchase on the whitening cobblestones. Acacia Avenue looked different under its blanket of snow, softer, less threatening, the houses transformed into something from a Christmas card or children's story. But we knew now what secrets those pleasant facades concealed, what darkness lurked behind their walls. Number 47 stood silent and still, only a single light showing on the ground floor where presumably Mrs. Harrow was still awake. We knocked at the servant's entrance again, and she answered quickly, her face showing relief at seeing us. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I'm so glad you've returned. I've been hearing them again, the sounds in the walls, louder than before, almost like someone trying to break through. I've been too frightened to investigate alone." "You did right to wait for us," Holmes assured her. "Mrs. Harrow, we need to conduct a thorough search of your chimney systems, and we may need to open some walls in the process. I'm afraid there will be damage to the house, but it's necessary to find the boy." "Do whatever you must," she said immediately. "Mr. and Mrs. Ashworth are good people. They'd never forgive me if we failed to help a child in need because of concern for wallpaper and plaster." We entered the house, and this time Holmes led us directly to the drawing room where he had found the first hidden compartment. He opened it with the practiced ease of familiarity, and we all crowded around to peer into the space beyond. The compartment was no longer empty. Huddled in its furthest corner, wrapped in what appeared to be an old curtain, was a small figure. A child, undoubtedly, though so covered in soot and grime that features were initially indistinguishable. "Billy," I called softly. "Billy Thornton." The figure stirred, and a face emerged from the wrappings. Pale, tear-streaked, eyes wide with a combination of hope and terror. "Help me," the child whispered, the voice cracked from disuse or screaming or both. "Please help me. I can't find the way out. I've been trying, but it's all dark, and I'm lost, and I can't." The words dissolved into sobs, and I immediately crawled into the compartment, my medical training taking precedence over all other considerations. The boy, for it was indeed Billy Thornton, we would confirm later, allowed me to examine him with the passive exhaustion of someone who has reached the absolute end of their resources. He was dehydrated, hypothermic, covered in scrapes and bruises, but fundamentally intact. No broken bones, no signs of serious injury beyond exposure and trauma. "Pettigrew, Morrison, we need blankets immediately," I called out. "And water. Just small sips at first. Holmes, we need to get him out of here and to a hospital." Between us, we extracted Billy from the compartment with infinite care, wrapping him in the blankets the constables retrieved from elsewhere in the house. He was barely conscious, drifting in and out of awareness, mumbling fragments that didn't quite cohere into sentences. The dark man kept moving, heard voices, but couldn't find. So cold. Thought I would die here. "You're safe now," I kept repeating, as much for my own reassurance as his. "You're safe. We found you. You're going to be all right." Lestrade had already dispatched Morrison to fetch a doctor's carriage, and while we waited, Holmes questioned Mrs. Harrow with urgent intensity. "The sounds you've been hearing, when did they begin?" "The day after the boy disappeared," she replied. "Starting that first night, scratching sounds, tapping sounds. I thought perhaps he was trapped somewhere in the chimney, but Mr. Cratchit insisted he must have gotten out through another fireplace. He searched the house himself, didn't find anything, and told me I was hearing things." Cratchit searched the house, Holmes repeated, and something in his tone made me look up from my care of Billy. He knew about the hidden spaces. He must have known. He came here, supposedly searching for Billy, but what he was actually doing was ensuring the boy remained trapped, unable to escape. The full horror of it settled over us like the falling snow, cold, comprehensive, suffocating. Cratchit hadn't been negligent. He had been complicit, possibly active in deliberately trapping children within these hidden spaces, for reasons we still didn't fully understand, but which could not possibly be innocent. "We need to arrest him," Lestrade said flatly. "Tonight, before he realizes we've found the boy and potentially flees." The carriage arrived, and we carefully loaded Billy into it, Mrs. Harrow insisting she would accompany him to the hospital and ensure he received proper care. Holmes provided her with enough money to cover all expenses, an uncharacteristically generous gesture that revealed how deeply this case had affected him. Once they had departed, we stood in the drawing room, Holmes, Lestrade, myself, and the remaining constables, surrounded by the evidence of terrible secrets, and planned our next moves with the grim determination of people who have seen too much darkness and are committed to bringing it into light. "We arrest Cratchit," Holmes said, "but we also need to discover the full extent of this network. How many houses were built with these hidden spaces? Are there other children trapped in them even now? Who designed this architecture and for what purpose? And..." He paused, his jaw tightening. "And what happened to the children who didn't escape?" That question hung unanswered, and perhaps unanswerable, at least for tonight. But we would pursue the answers, all of them, until this particular darkness had been fully illuminated, and the guilty had been held to account. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering London in white, obscuring the city's grime and sin under a blanket of apparent purity. But we knew better now. We had seen what lurked in the walls and chimneys, what secrets had been preserved in darkness for years, and we were determined that the darkness would hide nothing anymore. The arrest of Mr. Cratchit occurred in the grey hours before dawn, as snow continued its gentle assault on the sleeping city. Lestrade, with admirable efficiency, had obtained an emergency warrant from a magistrate who had been roused from sleep and presented with enough evidence, Sally's testimony, Billy's rescue, the discovered hidden spaces, to justify immediate action. We descended upon Cratchit's warehouse with a force of 6 constables, expecting potential resistance. We found none. The man was in his small office on the warehouse's 2nd floor, sitting at a desk covered in ledgers and papers, apparently working despite the hour. When Lestrade announced his arrest on charges of child endangerment and suspicion of involvement in multiple disappearances, Cratchit simply nodded, as if he had been expecting this moment for years. "It was only a matter of time," he said quietly, standing and offering his wrists for the manacles without protest. I wondered how long it would last. 23 years, as it happens, longer than I expected. "You admit complicity?" Holmes asked, stepping forward from where he had been observing from the doorway. Cratchit looked at him with eyes that might have held guilt or sorrow or simple exhaustion. It was difficult to determine which. "I admit I knew. I admit I said nothing. I admit I continued to send children to those houses even after I understood what was happening to them. Does that make me guilty? I suppose it does. But you must understand, Mr. Holmes, I was trapped too, in my own way. Trapped by fear, by debt, by forces larger than myself. "Explain," Holmes commanded, his tone brooking no evasion. Cratchit sank back into his chair, and Lestrade allowed it, recognizing that a confession here might save weeks of investigation. "It started before my time," Cratchit began, his voice taking on the quality of someone relieved to finally speak truths long suppressed. "The houses, those specific houses with the hidden passages, they were built by a man named Cornelius Blackwood back in the... and he was an architect with theories about using chimney systems for purposes beyond heating. Ventilation, yes, but also communication, hidden transportation routes, spaces for concealment. He built them into a dozen houses across St. John's Wood, all purchased by wealthy clients who may or may not have understood the full extent of what they were buying." He gestured to his desk, where one of the ledgers lay open. "I inherited the routes to those houses from my predecessor, old Thomas Wicklow. Before he died, he told me the truth, that the passages sometimes trapped children, that the design was flawed, that kids would get lost in the tunnels and die there, their bodies never recovered. He told me I should refuse to service those houses, should warn other sweeps away from them. But by then, I had debts, you see. Debts to men who don't accept excuses or refusals. The routes to those big houses in St. John's Wood, they paid well, very well, enough to keep my creditors satisfied. So I kept sending children up those chimneys, and sometimes they came down, and sometimes they didn't. And I told myself it wasn't my fault, that it was just the risks of the trade, that chimney sweeping has always been dangerous work." The silence that followed this confession was absolute. Holmes's expression had gone cold, carved from ice, and even Lestrade, who had heard countless criminals justify countless crimes, looked sick. "How many?" Holmes asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How many children did you send to their deaths?" "I don't know," Cratchit said, and now tears were sliding down his cheeks, though whether from genuine remorse or self-pity was impossible to determine. "I don't know the exact number. A dozen. More. They would go up into those houses, into those chimneys, and sometimes they would discover the hidden spaces and get lost in the tunnels. The passages connect in strange ways. You can enter from one house and end up in the walls of another house entirely. Children would wander in darkness for days, calling for help, trying to find a way out. Some did find exits eventually. Others just disappeared, and I kept my mouth shut because speaking would have meant losing my roots, losing my income, potentially losing my life to the men I owed money to." He looked up at Holmes with a desperate intensity. "But I never harmed them directly. You must understand that. I never intentionally sent them to their deaths. I just failed to protect them from a danger I knew existed. Is that murder? I don't know. But it's something, isn't it? Some terrible sin that has haunted me every night for 20 years. "It's murder," Holmes said flatly. "Perhaps not by law, but by any moral standard worth the name. You knew children were dying, and you continued to profit from the circumstances that killed them. That makes you culpable, Mr. Cratchit. Absolutely and unquestionably culpable." Lestrade nodded to his constables, who lifted Cratchit from his chair. "You'll have ample time to contemplate your culpability, Mr. Cratchit. Take him away." As Cratchit was led from his office, he called back over his shoulder, "The ledgers, Mr. Holmes. Everything is in the ledgers. Names, dates, routes. I kept meticulous records. It seemed the least I could do. bear witness, even if I couldn't bear to act. We remained in the office after he was gone, examining the ledgers he had indicated. They were indeed meticulous. 23 years of chimney sweep operations, listing every house serviced, every child employed, and, in a separate column marked only with a small cross symbol, notations for children who had disappeared. Billy Thornton's name was there, marked 3 days prior. Above him, Peter Johnson, 2 years earlier, Annie Richards, 3 years before that. The list stretched back through the years, a chronicle of loss and negligence that turned my stomach. 38, Holmes said, after counting through the marked entries. 38 children over 23 years. Not all would have died. Some truly did run away to other employment. Some aged out of sweep work and moved on. But even if half this number perished in those tunnels, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. We need to search those houses completely, Lestrade said. Bring in demolition crews if necessary. Open every wall, map every tunnel. If there are bodies, if there are remains, the families deserve to know. The children deserve proper burial and recognition. Agreed, Holmes said. But that will take time and resources beyond what tonight can provide. For now, we have Billy alive, we have Cratchit arrested, and we have these ledgers as evidence. Today, we'll begin the process of thorough investigation. We'll find every hidden space, trace every tunnel, recover every piece of evidence that remains, and will ensure that the children who died in darkness are finally brought into light. Dawn was breaking as we emerged from the warehouse, painting the snow-covered city in shades of pink and gold that seemed entirely too beautiful for the darkness we had been navigating. The streets were beginning to stir, early workers trudging through the snow, shopkeepers preparing for the day's business, the city's vast mechanism grinding into motion despite the weather. We returned to Baker Street to find Sally still awake, having apparently spent the entire night waiting for news. When we told her Billy had been found alive, she burst into tears, not of sadness, but of relief so profound it overwhelmed all other emotion. Mrs. Hudson held her while she cried, and I found myself moved by this display of compassion between two people who had been strangers mere days ago. "The others," Sally said when she could speak again. "The other children who work for Cratchit. They need to be told. They need to know they're safe now, that they don't have to go up those chimneys anymore." "They'll be informed," Lestrade assured her, "and they'll be placed under the protection of the Child Welfare Board until proper arrangements can be made for their care. No more chimney sweeping, Miss Wicks. Not for you, not for any of them. That chapter is closed." Holmes had been standing by the window, looking out at the snow-covered street with an expression of exhaustion that went beyond the physical. He had removed his coat and stood in shirt sleeves, seemingly oblivious to the cold that leaked through the window's imperfect seal. I recognized this state. It came after cases that extracted emotional as well as intellectual toll, that reminded him of the darkness humans were capable of inflicting on one another. "Holmes," I said quietly, approaching him, "you should rest. We all should. There's nothing more that can be done until the proper authorities take over the investigation." "You saved Billy," I reminded him. "Without your investigation, he would have died in that compartment. And now we can search those houses properly, recover remains if they exist, bring closure to families who have wondered and grieved. You've brought light into terrible darkness, Holmes. Take some comfort in that. He finally turned from the window, and I saw the toll this case had taken, etched in the lines of his face. I suppose you're right. We did what could be done. We saved one child, arrested a man who should have acted decades ago, uncovered a secret that had persisted too long. It will have to be enough. He moved to his chair, settling into it with the particular stillness that indicated he would remain there for some time, processing the case's implications, filing away details for future reference. I left him to his contemplations and found my own bed, crawling beneath covers that seemed impossibly welcoming after the night's exertions. Sleep came quickly, but it was not restful. I dreamed of children in chimneys, of darkness that pressed like physical weight, of voices calling from behind walls. When I woke in the late morning, I was tangled in sweat-damp sheets despite the room's cold, and my heart was racing as if I had been running. The following days saw a flurry of activity as authorities descended upon St. John's Wood to investigate the houses Holmes had identified. Structural engineers, police inspectors, representatives from the Child Welfare Board, and eventually journalists, all converged on those elegant townhouses to document the hidden passages and search for evidence of what had occurred within them. They found remains in 3 of the houses, small skeletons in hidden spaces, sometimes with fragments of clothing or tools that identified them as chimney sweeps. The discoveries were handled with all appropriate dignity, but the horror of them spread through London like a disease, generating headlines and public outrage. The chimney sweep tragedies became the scandal of the season, though some newspapers preferred more sensational titles. The Houses of Death, The Labyrinth Murders, The Hidden Horrors of St. John's Wood. Cratchit was charged with multiple counts of negligent homicide and child endangerment. His trial would come later, but few doubted the outcome. Public opinion had already convicted him, and the evidence was overwhelming. The 4 children who had remained in his employ were taken into protective custody, and, with the help of charitable organizations Holmes quietly directed funds toward, were placed in situations far removed from chimney sweeping, apprenticeships, schooling, even one case of adoption by a family seeking to make some small restitution for society's failures. Sally Wicks remained with Mrs. Hudson for several weeks while arrangements were made for her future. Holmes, with his characteristic efficiency, discovered that Sally's father was still alive in debtor's prison and used his connections, and a significant amount of money that he claimed came from successful investments, but which I suspected came from his own savings, to clear the man's debts and secure his release. Father and daughter were reunited in a scene that brought tears to Mrs. Hudson's eyes, though she tried to hide them behind claims of smoke from the kitchen fire. "You're to write to us," Mrs. Hudson commanded Sally at their parting. "Let us know how you're getting on, and if you need anything at all, you're to come straight to Baker Street. Do you understand?" Sally, dressed now in proper clothes that Mrs. Hudson had purchased from her own pocket, nodded solemnly. "I'll never forget what you've done for me, Ma'am, for all of us. You and Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson, you're heroes, you are. We're just people who chose to act when action was required," Holmes replied from where he stood by the window, his customary position. "The real heroes are the children who survived, who persisted, despite everything working against them. Remember that, Miss Wickes. You survived. That required more courage than anything we did. Billy Thornton recovered physically from his ordeal, though the psychological scars would likely persist for years. He, too, was placed with a family willing to take in a traumatized child and provide the care and patience necessary for healing. I visited him once at Holmes's request, ostensibly to check on his medical recovery, but actually to provide what comfort and reassurance a physician's presence could offer. He was quiet, still fearful of enclosed spaces, but there was life in his eyes, a resilience that suggested children's capacity to heal from even terrible trauma, given time and safety. The architectural firm of Blackwood & Sons had long since dissolved, its founder, Cornelius Blackwood, having died in 1867. Investigation into his background revealed a man obsessed with unconventional theories about building design, about creating structures that served multiple hidden purposes beyond their obvious functions. Whether his hidden passages were deliberately designed as traps or were merely flawed innovations that became dangerous when misused remained unclear. He had left no personal papers explaining his intentions, and without confession or clear evidence, his true purposes remained frustratingly ambiguous. What was clear was that his architecture had created spaces where vulnerable children could be lost, trapped, and forgotten. The houses themselves were gradually renovated, their hidden passages exposed and sealed, their interconnected chimney systems simplified and made safe according to modern standards. Some owners chose to sell, unable to live in homes tainted by such dark history. Others stubbornly remained, arguing that the buildings themselves were not evil, merely misused by negligent men like Cratchit. Holmes had remained subdued throughout these weeks of aftermath, throwing himself into other cases with perhaps more intensity than usual, as if trying to outrun the shadows that the chimney sweep case had cast. It was only now, as winter began its slow release and the first hints of spring started to green the parks, that I felt he had begun to process and accept what we had discovered. We were sitting one evening in our rooms, the fire burning low, both of us reading by lamplight. He absorbed in a monograph on tobacco ash analysis he was writing. I, in the latest novel Mrs. Hudson had recommended. The companionable silence was broken only by the occasional turn of pages, the soft crackle of the fire, the distant sounds of London settling into night. "Watson," Holmes said suddenly, setting aside his pen, "do you ever wonder about the cases we don't solve, the cries for help that never reach us, the mysteries that remain forever hidden?" I considered the question carefully. I think it would drive me to despair if I dwelt on it too much. We can only address the problems that come to our attention, Holmes. We cannot save everyone. No, he agreed quietly, but we can try to create conditions where fewer people need saving. The chimney sweeps case. It revealed systematic failures, Watson. Not just Cratchit's personal failings, but societal structures that allowed children to be exploited and endangered and forgotten. Those structures persist. Other children in other trades face similar dangers even now. What good are brilliant deductions and dramatic rescues if we fail to address the underlying conditions that make such tragedies possible? It was perhaps the most philosophical I had ever heard him, and it suggested depths of social conscience I had not fully appreciated. "You're right, of course, but you're also just one man, Holmes, however brilliant. You can't solve society's ills single-handedly." "Perhaps not," he replied, picking up his pen again, "but I can document them. I can create evidence that others might use to push for reforms. I can ensure that cases like Billy Thornton's don't simply disappear into memory, but rather persist as warnings, as calls to action. It's not detection, exactly, but it's related, the application of observation and reason toward the goal of preventing future crimes, rather than merely solving past ones. A worthy goal, I said, and one I'll support however I can. He smiled faintly. I know you will, Watson. You always do. Spring came gradually to London, as it always did, bringing longer days and warmer winds, and the first brave flowers in window boxes and parks. The scandal of the chimney sweep tragedies gradually faded from the newspapers' front pages, replaced by other sensations, other outrages. But changes had been set in motion. New inspections of architectural plans, stricter enforcement of child labour laws, increased oversight of chimney sweep operations. Not enough changes, perhaps, but more than there had been before. Billy Thornton sent a letter to Baker Street in early April, carefully printed in letters that suggested recently acquired literacy. He was well, he wrote, learning to read and write properly, helping his new family with their shop, still afraid of fires and enclosed spaces, but getting better. He wanted to say thank you. He wanted us to know he was alive because of us. The letter was simple, almost primitive in its expression, but it moved Holmes in ways I rarely witnessed. He kept it in his desk drawer, and sometimes in the evenings I would see him take it out and read it again, as if reminding himself why the work mattered. Sally wrote too, less frequently, but with growing confidence in her penmanship. She was learning a trade, dressmaking, under her father's supervision, in a small shop they had opened with the mysterious funds Holmes had provided. She was happy, she reported. Still had nightmares sometimes about chimneys and darkness, but her father helped her through the worst of it. She wanted to know if there was anything she could do to help other children in similar situations. Holmes wrote back with suggestions about charitable organizations she might contact, about ways she could use her experience to advocate for others. And life at Baker Street returned to its familiar rhythms, clients arriving with mysteries, both trivial and profound. Holmes alternating between manic energy and contemplative repose. Mrs. Hudson managing the household with her usual mixture of indulgence and firm boundaries. And myself chronicling it all, transforming the raw material of investigation into narratives that might inform, entertain, or inspire. Those were the moments when I understood most clearly the burden of the kind of awareness Holmes possessed, the ability to see patterns others missed, to detect connections others overlooked, came with the weight of knowing how much remained hidden, how many cries went unanswered, how many mysteries would never be solved. But it also came with the capacity to act, to illuminate, to bring light into darkness however we could, wherever we could, for as long as we were able. And that, in the end, was enough. Not perfect, not complete, but enough to justify the work, to motivate another day, another case, another attempt to make the world slightly less dark than we found it. The night deepens around you now, dear listener, as our story finds its natural conclusion. The fire in your hearth, whether real or imagined, has burned down to embers, casting the room in soft, warm shadow. Outside your window, London sleeps, or perhaps the city where you rest, or the countryside where you found this quiet moment. Wherever you are, whatever troubles brought you to this story seeking respite and rest, Know that the darkness is less absolute than it sometimes seems. There are always people working to bring light. Detectives and doctors, advocates and ordinary citizens who choose to see what others ignore, who choose to act when action seems difficult or dangerous. The world is full of hidden spaces, yes, but it is also full of people determined to illuminate them, to rescue those who need rescuing, to bear witness to suffering and work toward its prevention. The case of the chimney sweeps reminds us that mysteries often reflect larger truths about the societies that generate them, that individual crimes frequently reveal systemic failures, that solving one problem often means confronting many others. But it also reminds us of children's resilience, of the power of compassion, of the importance of taking action even when outcomes are uncertain. Billy Thornton survived. Sally Wicks found a better life. Cratchit was held accountable. The hidden spaces were exposed and sealed. Were all the lost children found? No. Were all the questions answered? No. But enough light was brought into darkness to matter, to make the investigation worthwhile, to justify hope that future children might be better protected. And now, as your own consciousness drifts towards sleep, as this story releases its gentle hold on your attention, let yourself rest in the knowledge that mysteries can be solved, that darkness can be illuminated, that even the most troubled circumstances can give way to something better. The work of understanding and improving the world continues, day after day, investigation after investigation, small acts of courage and compassion accumulating into something larger than themselves. Sleep now. Let the story fade like gaslight dimming. Let the concerns of waking life recede like footsteps in the distance. The fire burns low, the room grows quiet, and the night surrounds you with its soft darkness, not threatening now, but peaceful, restful, full of dreams that will carry you gently until morning. If you've enjoyed this journey through Victorian mystery and Gothic atmosphere, if this story has helped ease your transition into sleep, I invite you to subscribe to this channel, to like this video, to share it with others who might need this particular form of restful storytelling. There are more mysteries to explore, more cases to unravel, more gentle journeys into sleep that combine narrative engagement with calming atmosphere. Your support allows these stories to continue, these nighttime journeys to proliferate, these small sanctuaries of peace to exist in our busy, often overwhelming world. Thank you for spending these hours with me, for letting this story of chimney sweeps and hidden passages, of courage and compassion, of darkness and light, accompany you toward rest. May your sleep be peaceful, your dreams gentle, your rest complete. Good night, dear listener. Good night, wherever you are. May you wake refreshed, restored, ready to face whatever mysteries your own life presents, secure in the knowledge that even the darkest chimneys eventually lead back to light, that even the longest nights eventually surrender to dawn, that even the most difficult journeys eventually bring us home. Sleep well, sleep peacefully, sleep deeply, and good night.